a ridiculous amount of foil that I was using to try to like hold different pieces up. Oh, hello, Professor.
Hello. My goodness, I'm sorry I'm late to the party. You guys have started without me, which is
Well, we were
just
just
fine.
talking about everything.
Which is just fine. Hello, everybody. So you guys kind of keep talking. I need to like take attendance and see who's all here. I just walked in. I was writing a test over the lunch hour. Aurora, I'm sorry if I missed you for the meeting that we were supposed to have at noon today. I was sitting here and I was just totally stressed out about writing this quiz.
Don't even worry about it. I also missed the meeting we were supposed to have today.
Okay, we're good. It's all good. Okay, let me go. My other clipboard is over there, so I'll be right back. Ah, dear. Okay. So far, there are like 4 or 5 participants here with us today, so more people should be showing up here as we get started. Aurora. Here we go. All right, and Dylan is here. And also Elizabeth. And let's see, Ringa, fantastic. Okay, yay. So far, it's just us, which is good. So I'm sitting over here at my design work table. So I'm going to like turn my computer and move my whole operation over to the sculpture work table. So do while you guys are still like sculpting on your stuff, and that's so wonderful. You're sculpting on your stuff. This is good. Okay. All right. So I'm moving, and then the camera's gonna move, and everybody's gonna move. Okay. It's such a professional operation when you just take your camera and swing it over that way. And I think that might be all I have to do today. Oh, and like get stuff. So I'm going to get stuff put over there. Keyboard and mouse, because you can't do anything without a keyboard and mouse input. Inputting devices. All right. Shove, clean. All right, clean sweep and a shove, and here we go. Woohoo! So, I left my board, clipboard over here, and my notes. Don't you just love this Zoom stuff? I know I do. Okay, anybody else join us? No. Okay, fine. Since it's about 6 or 7 minutes after the hour, I should probably just start. Let's see. So, would you guys mind if I shared my screen and tried to talk about this stuff? And people will come in and they will get situated and everything. But I thought I should give us some background about this whole non-objective freeform sculpture stuff, and where did I get the idea, and how does it relate to art history or some of the movements in art and abstraction and all that stuff, and can we even get comfortable with abstraction here in the 21st century when we are now 50 or 70 years removed from all of that abstract expressionism that was happening in mid-century in the 20th century when I was born. So let's see what we can do here. I can tell you guys that I ran into this stuff in college, just like you are doing. I wanted to go to college and learn how to be an artist. And when I got to college, I wanted to do all the stuff that I wanted to do, and was appalled, I tell you, appalled at the idea that I had to do assignments that, showed me other stuff and tried to expand my horizons and blow my mind and show me other stuff that was related to art history. So anyway, I gritted my teeth and I bore the responsibility, the terrible um, journey that was playing with abstraction. And I didn't like it at the time. And it only when I became a teacher later on and I had to then teach this stuff to other people did I really start to at least wrap my brain around it, because then I had to do it and I had to understand it so that I could try to make other people understand it or help other people understand. I can't make you guys do anything, as you no doubt know already. So having said all that, let me share something with you guys for just a little bit. I'm gonna hit my share screen and I'm gonna see if it'll actually let me do the share screen. I'm gonna share this. It's my happy little slideshow that I wanted to show you guys today. So let's try this, because how bad could it be, really? So non-objective, non-representational sculpture. I have to put all of you people's faces away so that I can see what I'm doing here. So I talked about the artist named Jean Arp, also known as Hans Arp, depending on whether you are on which side of the French or German border you're on. But he was a surrealist, and he did a lot of non-objective sculpture that has a, because the painters were surrealists at the time, he kind of found himself lumped in with the surrealists. And so in the 1930s to around the 1950s, he's producing work. And so let's look at this first piece here. This is cast bronze. It's polished. It has a high polish on it, so we're not dealing with any texture at all, except, of course, the texture of smoothness. So you'll just kind of say, oh, well, that's kind of a circular kind of a composition with a bunch of bumps on it. And you'd be right, and it sort of is. But when we kind of get in here a little bit and we start to evaluate and analyze the quality of the bumps and try to, see whether we like the bumps, whether the bumps are attractive to us, we might start to try to pick out some human body parts possibly. And like this could possibly be thought of as a human torso, perhaps a female human torso. We have some bumps that are rounded bumps that could be hips or elbows or legs or forearms or something like that. And some bumps that have just a little bit of a point out at the end of the bump that might look a little bit like a breast form or something like that. And yes, these are sort of like disembodied and rearranged body parts. And when I'm teaching my design class, our working definition of abstraction in design is simplified or slightly rearranged elements from reality. And so this really fits that definition because the elements in here, the shapes, are somewhat simplified and possibly rearranged a little bit to satisfy the needs of the artist to create a composition. I like this kind of sculpture because it just springs from the floor without having to have a base element like bolted onto it, like some kind of board or some kind of other thing down here, so that it's very much just about the sculpture, and it doesn't really have to have what we would try to consider a base element or something. Let's keep moving and see what happens here. Here's another Jean Arp piece. Again, I don't have a real date or a thing for this, although I might try to consider this a reclining piece. It's a horizontal piece rather than a completely vertical piece. And again, as soon as I say organic, or as soon as I say abstracted, reclining figure form, you can start to see that in a lot of the very sensual roundness of these forms that flow into other organic forms. And some of them are very round that feel a lot more fleshy forms. And some of them have edges to the forms so that it almost feels like a bone underneath skin or flesh, with the flesh getting pulled tight, against this bone, like the the iliac crest of the hip bone, how it, protrudes a little bit through your skin, right around your hips on either side of your body. And that a similar kind of a ridge is over here, and you can't see it really well. Now, this particular horizontal piece is sitting on a base element. We've got something sitting here that sort of looks like a rounded, flat, planar base that might be 4 or 5 inches thick. And then the actual part of the sculpture that we would consider the sculpture is the organic elements that are kind of sitting horizontally on top of this thing. Those two were cast bronze. This one feels a lot more like carved marble. It's white. It kind of has a marble feel to it. Again, for my money, this feels like perhaps a reclining nude or a nude torso with possibly, you might think of it in terms of more of a female torso than a male torso. It just has some very nice rounded features on it. This particular rounded feature comes to a point right here. This other rounded feature up here comes to another point right here, which resemble breast forms, I believe. I really love how the thing just kind of morphs right into this larger area in the background that feels, again, perhaps like hips or the bottom half of a torso. And I love the fact that it has this kind of this twist from the top end of what I'm calling, with my heavy air quotes here that you can't see, the torso in the upper half, kind of twisting into this bottom area, which is a little bit more like hips. It has more of a massive quality to it, and with a possibility of more bony protuberances and that kind of thing. But anyway, again, this one feels a little bit more like a horizontal sculpture, and I like how it is liberated from the tabletop. It has no base, and all it does is it sits on these 2 points over here, and then it comes to rest on some point over here, and there's this wonderful negative space underneath of it that really helps to liberate it from the tabletop or the pedestal top or whatever we're looking at here. Most of these art pieces, you'll come to realize, are way more about volumetric form than about lines or linear form. And I noticed that Aurora had a big linear form looping over the top of her piece, which is fine. That's great. But we're going to talk about developing a vocabulary of form, and what you want to do with that vocabulary of form in a piece of this size and this scale. So in this art piece that we're looking at here, again, we have his kind of vocabulary of form here, the very rounded, volumetric kinds of forms that are very sensual and also very organic. And they flow into other volumetric forms, except, in some places, those forms become a little thinner and they become a little bit more linear. But ARP's linear forms are kind of shorter connective tissue, kind of spanning 2 of the larger, volumetric, kind of biomorphic organic forms. But this is a really wonderful, this kind of feels like a knee on a figure, kind of lifted up here, or the hip. You really can't tell. He's really morphing stuff together so that it's fairly non-objective. Here's another one. I get a kick out of this because with the background, with, I don't know what this wall element is back here with all of the rivets in it, it really feels like it's made out of metal, and it has this riveted kind of texture dealing with it. And so we get this sense of 20th century technology in the background. And when I look at this piece, at first it looks like a great big nose of a sculpture, because you've kind of got the bridge of the nose and the tip of the nose, and perhaps the idea of 2 nostrils on either side. But as soon as I take it in the context of this technology in the background, and I start to look at these things that I thought were nostrils at first, but they seem to be almost like more truncated wings, that kind of airfoils in shape with sharp leading edges and trailing edges. And suddenly this looks a lot more like an airplane or an airplane fuselage, or possibly even a rocket, the way that is kind of pointed upwards and has an ascending quality to it. So it's, it's mid 20th century. It is, kind of playing with ideas that the surrealists are playing with, but we get this futuristic kind of approach to the high technology of the time, which was aircraft, especially, World War II, those kinds of airplanes and stuff like that. So that has that feel to it. And that feel even comes down into what is kind of a built-in bass element in the bottom of the piece, because it sort of feels like an aircraft part too. It's sort of wing-like, like these little tiny wing-like structures on either side of the fuselage area. It also has the possibility of being a shroud that would go over the top of a wheel on a 1940s aircraft landing gear. And so as landing gear, as the base element, it kind of, they're playing with the idea of landing gear and just sticking that down here so that it's got something to spring off of, something to stand upon on the pedestal. Anyway, I got a kick out of this one because it wasn't just the sensuality of the human body. It was also the possibility of the sensuality of airplanes and aircraft design too. This one, again, has all of that organic kind of flowing sensuality to it. And so you don't really have to change your shapes all that much, going from one shape area of the composition, flowing into other shape areas of the composition. We're just doing slight variations on a theme here for these biomorphic forms, these very sensual organic shapes here. It kind of feels like a crouching figure. It's got everything, including kind of the idea of arms that might be trying to hug itself in its torso area. This feels like a head or a great big brain or skull kind of up at the top of this thing. But, from some aspects, it feels like a skull, and from other aspects, it's the entire upper torso kind of leaning over and hugging into itself. And so this does always double duty as possibly an arm form or possibly the head form. We have another possible arm form here with this negative space in the center, this wonderful negative space down below, separating the upper area of the composition from its lower areas, and then yet another negative space down here at the bottom, which gives us, it opens up this base element here, the part that's contacting the pedestal, so that we're not just like rooted to this thing, but it helps to liberate this visually, so that we're just contacting on these little tiny feet, these little pointy feet here, and there's probably at least one more pointy little foot on the other side that we can't see, giving us at least 3 points of contact on the tabletop or base element below. Keep going, James. Then they morph into other kinds of things, because this has kind of fishtail, fishy things. It's kind of like a fish jumping out of water kind of feeling to it, but also the sense of possibly something spiritual, something human. And you get into these ideas of eggs, egg shapes, and the possibility of this negative space in here being like a sacred space, like a womb. This starts to maybe feel like it's female, and maybe the big, huge sacred space in here is like a womb with all of these foot elements and arm elements coming around to kind of like hold and hug this central egg of sacred space that's in the center of it. So again, the shapes and forms have a kind of a similarity to them. He's in this sculpture creating a vocabulary of form that is mostly kind of all of these longer, pointed on one end, sort of linear shapes, but they also are sort of like tail shapes or tentacle shapes. And so there's enough variety in here to make it interesting for us to look at. and enough harmony among all these different versions of that shape to hold it together as a harmonic, harmonious sculpture with lots of factors of unity, kind of holding it together visually as a sculpture. Um, and so you can just kind of see over and over again this idea of organic form in the Jean Arp kinds of pieces. Um, Another sculptor, you know, contemporary sculpture, and these are either stone pieces or they could even be cast stone pieces. Now, this is a lot bit more difficult for us to do, and this goes a little bit outside of what we can do in clay, because as stone pieces or cast stone, I think we've got two steel elements in here that have been kind of drilled and glued in to two sockets in these two pieces to, again, kind of create a very tension-filled negative space between these two very large elements that sort of echo each other in terms of their shape and space and everything. Polished on the outside and rough on the inside. So, you know, they're exploring a couple more ideas here in terms of texture. But this goes a little bit beyond what I want to do in our piece, because it introduces a secondary kind of an idea or element in here joining these together. So this is almost a multimedia piece, but it's not just kind of this sculpture that's just supposed to be about the additive process. You know, here's another one that's just kind of a very swoopy thing. This is very much in keeping with what a student work might be. I like the bottom of this piece because it has ways of cutting into it and creating negative spaces and then lifting underneath the element kind of slightly. Again, with a little bit of cast shadow and a lot of movement in the bottom of it, it doesn't feel like it's rooted to the tabletop or rooted to the board. You know, you need this kind of broken up area down below to give it a little bit more of a sense of life or a sense of movement or implied movement, like it has two legs and it might possibly walk off into the distance. These negative spaces that a lot of these sculptors are using are a really nice way to break up the sculpture and create interior spaces and give you a way of hollowing out the piece without having to hollow out this major area in here, because the sculptor has already created a negative space which does the job of hollowing it out. And so only this thicker area of the sculpture would needed to be hollowed out, you know, later on in the production process. I got a belly full of Henry Moore. Henry Moore was shoved at me a lot when I was a sculpture student, saying, James, why don't you do more of this? Everybody loves Henry Moore. Why don't you do more of Henry Moore? And so there was all of that. I just needed to see if there's more participants. That's good. And I wanted to see if there was, if I could open up, I guess I can't from here. I wanted to open up the chat. Oh, there's one person in the chat. Sorry, I'm late. Okay, no problem. Welcome. Thanks for coming. So Henry Moore has organic pieces that are also based on organic forms, mostly bones. He liked to collect a lot of animal bones and have them around his studio. And so we get these segments that have an organic quality to them, but are working with edges and textures that feel a lot more like the bones and sockets and the way that bones fit together in skeletons, and not just human skeletons, but other kinds of, you know, large mammal skeletal bone kind of structures too. It is interesting to see how these three elements here, this one element here, and then one element here, and then this one little bit larger element that kind of swoops up behind. So we get pretty much three elements that are more or less connected to each other. And so they have a similarity to them and yet just enough variety to them so that they're a bit different from all different sides. It's what we're looking for in a sculpture, you know, a little bit of difference here. Another Henry Moore piece, again with similar elements that kind of wrap around and come together. These are almost like two old-fashioned telephone receivers. We've got a telephone receiver sitting on top of another telephone receiver here, but they're more organic and they're a little bit more bony. And they have curving areas on them, and then they have sharp edges on them. And they've got this wonderful negative space, which kind of is larger on this side, but that does tunnel all the way through to a negative space that I can see light through the middle of it in the distance. So it's like a big, bony, kind of a donut. And you know, who doesn't like a big, bony donut? I love a big, bony donut. Some of Moore's pieces, again, have this bony quality to them, especially if they're done in this white. This could possibly be carved marble, by the way. And so we get the sense of the animal figure kind of sitting here. We get this sense with a sweeping, curving, bony protuberance like this of possibly a big hip bone. And then we get these ideas of these leg bones here. And I love how the end of this leg bone kind of element here picks up on this idea of this negative space here, which has a very similar size and shape to it. The negative space is shaped a lot like the positive end of this element here, which probably also would be shaped a lot like the positive end of this element up here, which we can't see because we're looking at it from the side instead of down from the top. But it would probably it would present an edge or an end to it a lot like this shape here and this shape here. Again, Moore is playing with a base element here, which you may or may not need to deal with. I would prefer that we not deal with base elements if we can at all avoid it. If we can find a way to get our sculpture to stand on its own foot, or even better, 2 or 3 feet, and be somewhat liberated from a base or from a tabletop, that would be great. Henry Moore loved skulls, and so a lot of his pieces have a skull-like quality to them, with perhaps negative spaces in the upper register that felt like eyes, other elements in negative spaces that might feel like jaws or noses or snouts or something like that. And yet it is organic enough and unified enough so that it doesn't look like any one particular skull. It has skull qualities to it, and yet it does not necessarily have to be a skull at all. This is a nuclear war, nuclear energy kind of a piece from the 1940s, after World War II and after the atomic bomb and all of that kind of stuff. And again, it's really interesting to see the roundness of this large round form here, which feels both like a skull possibly, or the helmet of a warrior, or the mushroom cloud of a nuclear explosion, of an atomic bomb explosion. And then it's kind of sitting, morphing right into some of these leg elements down here, which are much more geometric in feel, or at least they feel a lot more like bones, whereas this up here feels a lot more, it has a different feeling between these more geometric leg elements down here and the mushroom cloud in the upper part of this thing. I think I'm going to quit now because I've just run out of slides. So I'm going to stop sharing this thing and come back to all of you because you're all lovely. I'm going to pin my video here and check in. So Paula's here, yay, and Catherine is here. Fantastic. I got to make sure you guys get points for being here today. So where's Catherine living? Catherine is living right here, and Paula is on page 2. All right. So I just wanted to take us through some more examples of the idea of organic form in sculpture, like especially ARP. Jean Arp's pieces really appeal to me because I'm a figurative sculptor. I really love the forms of the human body. I can't bring myself to, for my own work, my body of work is naturalistic and representational figurative form, and I specialize in the nude. So that's what I do, and I really like that. But I can see the value in being influenced by those forms and then trying to bring those into some of these ideas. I've got the piece here that I started the other day, and I left it uncovered for about 8 hours on Tuesday, and then I uncovered it this morning when I came into work. So it's been uncovered for another 4 hours today. So this has a lot more stiffness to it. It's very cold to the touch. It's not quite leather hard. It is still soft enough that I can, it works like moist clay, only it's a very stiff moist clay. So moist clay is what we're going to want to be working with in terms of a vertical element, because you can now pile stuff on this, and it is stiff enough so that if I did rip this piece out of here, it will definitely sustain its own shape and form, because it is just dry enough and stiff enough to be able to do that. And then if I thought, oh geez, I made a mistake, I got to put that back in, well, I can go ahead and I can put that back in. That would be great. When I played with some of this idea of genre art forms before, I'm reinterpreting this my way, and so I was doing the same thing, piling up the clay, and then starting to, with some of these lumps and just some of these protuberances on the roughed out piece, how would I come in and kind of identify certain protuberances and then make them more sharply defined in terms of what they're next to, and what would I make them, how would I respond to them in terms of volumetric shapes? Would they be lumps? Would they be bumps? What would they be? Well, I was playing with fleshy figurative elements, and so some of these, yes, are very much breast form like pieces, or something that feels like a buttocks, or that kind of a thing. I was interested in some of those crevices and cracks that would come out and around and be very volumetric, and that kind of concept. And I was then looking for other kinds of forms that weren't just potatoes, or just breast forms or something like that. And I was trying to come up with some maybe two shapes that I could alternate and play with in the composition, maybe some primary shapes and some secondary shapes. And what I came up with was these spiky shapes that kind of come out like a horn, or come up with a kind of a point on them, because they can be like a horn shape or something else, and yet the other end of them can still be rounded on the backside, and they can blend into the rest of the sculpture. And then all I'm trying to figure out is, well, what are my transitions? How do I make transitions from one shape to another? Do the shapes just flow seamlessly from one end to another? Or do they have a little bit more of an abruptness to the transition between shapes and forms? And so this particular sculpture has a lot of deeper crevices and more defined ends to one shape as it then transitions into a different shape that is, again, a volumetric shape or something like that. But I'm trying to limit my vocabulary of shapes and forms to like 2 or 3 different kinds of ideas that are as closely related to each other as possible, so that I get enough harmony in the composition for the thing to hold together visually, and just enough variety in the composition to make it interesting for the viewer. Because you don't want to make the viewer bored or something like that. You'd like to make the viewer interested. So, trying to come up with a set of shapes and a set of, if you're interested in negative spaces, then you're going to be working with linear forms or planar forms, perhaps more than volumetric forms. This is a piece from 10 years ago. And I decided, 10 years ago, I wasn't as comfortable with volumetric forms. And so I was, playing with lots of linear forms, but just a linear forms makes the thing look like just a big pile of spaghetti. So I started to play with making some of my lines a little bit thicker, and having the line become just a little bit more of a volume, I'm sorry, not a volume, a planar form, so that the linear form, as it wrapped around, as it became a coil, or a linear form that wrapped from one area of the sculpture into another, that it also had perhaps some calligraphic quality to the line quality so that it got thicker or thinner, or in my case, I even started to get kind of bumpy and bony with it as it kind of came around. And so this is a strange piece, but in the end, this felt like a whole bunch of little crab claws, because some of the crab claws have elements that become a little bit more linear to them, and some parts they taper to a point, and sometimes we have a secondary point or something like that. And so it has that quality of like, crab claws, a whole bunch of, whatever. But I try to keep, once I find some shapes that I like, I try to keep the vocabulary of shapes relatively under control so that I don't have 5 or 6 or 7 different kinds of shapes that are completely different in the sculpture. Having said all that, it looks like Elizabeth is trying to say something or wants to get my attention. Elizabeth, do you want to say something, or are you trying to get my attention?
No.
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 Okay. All right. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, you're okay.
Coming back into this thing for day 2, then, how would I start to respond to this thing or whatever? Well, since I started to get some S-curving movement of some of the major forms happening through this thing, that's nice, because then I got movement to work with. And then I can maybe start looking at some of these bumps as maybe individual forms, and I can kind of work with, am I doing it? Am I doing anything that makes sense? I'm starting to like create a stronger, more vivid, transition between things. This was just kind of a flowing organic form before, but if I come in here and I actually, cut into this a little bit and then try to get this to become just an organic bump here with a sharper, more deeper transition where there's more of a cast shadow, then suddenly when you've got a sharp transition, then it gives the viewer's eye, a place to come to rest, and so, instead of just kind of flowing over the whole piece. So okay, so then I made a transition. Shit. Now what do I do? Well, maybe I'll do that in a couple more places and see what that kind of feels like in terms of transitions, because you can have transitions that are more of a sharply defined crevice. And so this shape kind of comes in and ends, and then another shape flows out of the bottom of it. And you can have areas where the shape just morphs and it just flows into another shape. And so, that's kind of how we can play with this stuff. What is enough of a shape that, I'm satisfied with the shape and I like it, and what's too much of a shape that, is almost like it calls too much attention to itself. It becomes too much of a focal point. It's like too smooth or too finished or too linear or too something. And that idea is not kind of generally repeated throughout the composition so that the whole thing kind of feels like it all belongs together. And I'm sorry to pick on Aurora, but I'm going to pick on Aurora because she did her piece so fast on the first day and sent me a picture of it.
I'm still working on it.
It's lovely, but I thought that linear form that I saw you start with on Tuesday was just a little bit too much and all isolated by itself and all up on the top. And so if you can bring another linear form down below and create another perhaps negative space and start to maybe generalize those linear forms in 2 or 3 places in the sculpture, that would help. Or to bring some of the chunky funkiness of the lower part of the sculpture back up into the linear form, so it's got chunk and funk up there and it's not quite so smooth. That's the idea of trying to generalize a vocabulary of form throughout the sculpture, so that you've got your thinner, smaller. God, it doesn't help when I wear a brown shirt and I'm sculpting brown clay here. This does not help. But this is a smaller version of what's going on over here. And so it's still got additive texture to it. It still changes and funks out in places, changes its thickness along its length, and changes its character a little bit, has some bumpy, bony protrusions, that kind of thing. And so I'm so deep into my own stuff, I can't stand it anymore. But anyway, this is the kind of thing where it's kind of a journey instead of, knowing where you're going real fast. You kind of have to, play with these ideas. And so you make something and then you tear it apart and then you try something else and see how that works. And then by making one thing, you might wind up destroying another thing. In every act of creation, there's an act of destruction. I don't know who said that. It's a pretty good quote. We ought to use it. So I'm not afraid of destruction, especially when I almost tip my sculpture over. But I'm always interested in trying to liberate my piece from the tabletop by somehow making a variety of ways that it interacts with the board so that it's hopefully just standing on a couple of feet with maybe some kind of negative space in there so that it's not just coming down as a pedestal. It's not just coming down like a column to a column base, that there's some movement in and out of the bottom of the sculpture a little bit. And we always talk about in mathematics of 3 points. 3 points constitute a plane, that if you have things sitting on 3 points, that will be like a three-legged stool and it will sit on a surface and it'll stand up. 2 is more problematic unless they are really wide feet. It's really hard for something to stand up like this. It's kind of rocky and whatever. So I'd like, your sculpture to have at least 3 points of contact with the board. And of course, it's going to have all kinds of contact. But if somehow it feels like it's making contact in 3 places or 4 places, or if it's a centipede, it's making contact in 100 places. But I mean, I'm just trying to feel like, how can I create something as interesting as a negative space, this negative space up here? How can I do that down here so that I've got just a little bit of, extra cast shadow that kind of helps to liberate it from the tabletop? I talk way too much. Oh, Aurora has a hand up. Look at that. There's a blue hand. Hello, lower your hand. Tell me what you want to say. Or did you go to the bathroom?
Me? No. So I was looking at the green sculpture that you had showed earlier and noticing that you had taken a lot of the linear forms and like flattened them out to make other things. But my question for that is, when you go into hollow it, how much of that did you have to hollow?
Most of the crab claws in that thing are solid.
Okay.
I think most of that sculpture is solid. I don't think I hollowed much of it out because everything wound up being a planar form. The
Right.
crab claws are kind of a plane. They have an interior curve, they have an exterior curve like your hand. And if they have a secondary point on them, it's a smaller point than the main point. And as a solid form, that really wasn't very thick. It was less than 2 inches thick. And 2 inches of cross-sectional thickness is like my place where if it's thicker than 2 inches thick, I will hollow it out. So I have to hollow this section of the sculpture here, but this one I could leave remain solid because it's less than 2 inches thick for the most part.
And then
yeah.
the other thing that I wanted to ask you about is, so as I'm working through this more, because it was a lot of like additive process to do it, but I've added a lot of like I can't speak right now, but the weird
Linear
little
form.
almost tree trunk like things throughout the whole sculpture. And I also have a ton of negative spaces in through here. But I'm still like working on that. And then I was going to go in and add texture. Do I need to add like carved out texture? Do I need to add that more as I'm going through the sculpture? And then that's my last question.
Sometimes texture, real final texture comes at the end because, when we're cutting this apart to hollow it out and doing all this other kind of stuff, we're kind of destroying surface sometimes. And then we have to restore or rebuild surface at the end. So sometimes texture isn't always just a natural part of the additive process. Sometimes we have to fix it at the end of the sculpture, and that's
Okay.
fine too.
That's why I've been waiting. So.
Okay.
All right.
That's good. There's one more sculpture I want to bring in here. It's in the other room, and it's not my favorite sculpture, but I want to talk about it just in terms of linear form gone crazy. So I'm gonna go get it and bring it back. All right. So this sculpture for me has pros and cons. This sculpture is all linear forms, and it's all a whole bunch of spaghetti, all kinds of linear forms all linked together and everything else, and it's just crazy. And I like the bottom of it because it definitely has a whole bunch of negative spaces, a whole bunch of feet down here contacting the tabletop, so it is definitely liberated from the tabletop. But sometimes you can get too much of a good thing, and this is an awful lot of a good thing. There's an awful lot of linear stuff going on in here, and the overall effect is kind of like a blobular form, because the outside shape of all of these linear forms all kind of taken together gives us little more than just kind of this effect. Now I like it because it's kind of like a bowling ball, and I can pick it up, I can put my fingers into the holes and I can pick it up just like a bowling ball. And so that's nice, because it's easy to move when it's kind of bowling ball shaped or textured. But it's almost too much of a good thing, because there's so much of the similar thing going on in this that it doesn't have any other shape idea happening in here. The closest thing is on the side that's towards you guys now, because there are some elements that actually come straight down from about the halfway point or a little bit below the halfway point, and they become a little bit more substantial feet or leg elements on that side, on your side. And that's kind of nice. Sometimes if we get to a point in a sculpture where we can't figure out what to do, and looking for something that will fix up a sculpture, I might say take the wire tool and cut the whole sculpture off the board and set it over to the side, and take another 3 or 4 inches of clay and throw that on the board, and then take the sculpture and put it on top of that, and then try to work the two masses back together again, because sometimes we're dealing with something that's relatively squatty, and it isn't quite a foot tall or something like that, and I really wanted it to be 16 inches tall. And there's always a better idea, there's a better concept happening in the top half of the sculpture. And so sometimes by cutting it off and then sticking 4 inches of clay underneath it and setting it back on there, it forces you then to kind of refigure what's going on in the upper half and the lower half of the sculpture, and how to somehow unify those two ideas together. I've also asked people to take their sculpture, cut it off the board, and flip it upside down and set it on its head, upside down, and then build off of the foot, adding more clay to the top. Again, trying to reach out further. Somehow the beginning piece of the sculpture was a good idea, at least on one side, either the upper register or the lower register. And sometimes it's fun to flip it upside down. It forces us to do something else, and to not get stuck with just the thing we've got. The scary part about this sculpture is that it's easy to get stuck. You work on this for a day or two, and then you think, oh God, I don't really want to change anything else. I'm scared to change anything else. I don't know where to go with this, but I don't know. But I like what I've got. I've worked really hard on this, and it doesn't want me to change it. Something like that. And that's the funny thing about sculpture. It'll change. It's just clay. It's just moist clay. And my teacher back in the 1980s liked to make somebody cry in the sculpture class at least once a week. He would go around and if he didn't like a piece that you were working on, he would shove it onto the floor and make you start over again. And so, you had the embarrassment of having your piece shoved onto the floor and everybody laughs, ha, 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 ha. And then you have to pick your piece up in its mangled state and stick it back on the pedestal and then try to work again. And even though that was super cruel, the idea was that it overcame all of the inertia that was kind of built into having a piece that had 8 hours of work done on it, and that a person couldn't move, couldn't fix it, couldn't make it grow or change anymore. And so that little bit of inertia of pushing it on the floor, helps to get you through that sticking point of being stuck, and then move on to a next thing, another possible thing. You guys are lucky because I can't come over there and push your sculpture onto the floor, and you get mad at me if I did. Uh-oh, Paula's here. She's got her hand up. What's up, Paula?
Oh, I had a hard time getting the verticality in there. I didn't leave my clay uncovered and it didn't dry out enough. So I've got a lot of supports on it right now.
That's good. Temporary supports are fantastic.
But I had problems with smaller parts drying out too fast and getting cracky, and it is kind of squatty. I'm only at about 12 inches tall right now.
Okay. Well, that's generally where I recommend, cutting it off the board and shoving 4 or 5 more inches of clay under it and then setting it back on top of that. And that forces you then to deal with the neck with 5-inch taller sculpture.
Well, I think if it hardens up a little bit, I could keep going up with it. I just need it to firm up a little bit because it's got a limpy.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, I'm not asking you guys to do anything, radical, like actually show me your pieces or anything at this point. But by Tuesday, next Tuesday, I think we'd like to try to play the show and tell game. And with a sculpture in the round, it's much easier to just do it with the webcam, because if you've got a fairly neutral background, or if you're wearing a contrasting color shirt, you can sit behind the sculpture, and then we can see it without having to take a picture of it and do the screen share thing or anything else. So that's what I'd like to suggest for next time. I see we're coming up on 2 o'clock now. And I'd like to ask you guys if there's any other questions or comments. Please go ahead and unmute your mic for that stuff. But I'm thinking I'm going to wrap it up for today. So you got my whole spiel, even if you didn't like it very much, on organic form. And so think of it in terms of organic form, because sometimes that's the easiest way to think of non-objective, non-representational stuff. Because if it is fleshy forms, like thighs and hips and breast forms, that's one thing. If it's bony forms like leg bones and hip bones or crab claws, that's another thing. You can kind of see with the texture of the clay that you can go either way. You can go super smooth and sensual with it, or with this kind of rough and additive process, it can be fairly alien and more sharp and nasty too. So, that's what we're playing with. I think that the idea of the negative space in here is a lot of fun, because it does tend to open up the center of the piece so that it's not just so damn monolithic that way. And that way you can have a major expression and then minor expressions. And there could be 2 of them, or 3 or 4. I would like to try to get us away from 6 or 7 different areas of the composition, especially if they're completely different shapes. So if you've got, a linear piece in one area, and you've got a whole bunch of mushroom pieces in another area, and then you've got dingleberries in another area, and another little place that's like a little waterfall or something like that. Try to get it together. Try to pull your ideas together and unify the sculpture so that it hangs together visually just a little bit more, if possible. And I know I can't tell you what to do. because, you know, I've been doing this for 35 years and I can't tell people what to do. I can try to guide you and we can talk about these things. But it's also about your sensibilities, your aesthetics too. So it's kind of a two-way street where we're working on here. I don't see any other hands up or microphone.
have
There's
one
Aurora.
question.
Yes.
So just because you picked on me, now I have to ask you. So this upper area, you said if I bring in something, you know, thicker to kind of marry the top of the piece to the bottom of the piece, you think that would help the composition of it? Because when I had first started it, it was like 21 inches high or so. And as I was working through the clay and adding twists, it shrunk to about 16 inches. So I'm thinking of adding thicker linear still elements because the linear movement of the piece is really what I'm repeating throughout the sculpture from bottom to top. So
yeah, okay.
Okay.
This has morphed and changed a lot since I saw it on Tuesday. And now I am seeing larger planar areas with some holes in them that kind of remind me of coral or something. And then I see some of the more linear pieces being a little bit more like tentacles or bridging elements between the larger planar elements, the coral pieces. It has an overall coral feel to it. I feel like I'm a little fishy that wants to swim around in this thing, which is a good thing because I'm moving through all of these interesting spaces and shapes that you are creating. So it's actually really good and it's come a long way since Tuesday.
Yes.
I'm jazzed about it. The only thing is that it gets to be a little bit thin and fussy or delicate up at the top and a little bit more massive at the bottom. So as it's drying out, if you can try to get some of the mass taken out of the bottom and maybe add a little bit more mass to the top element so that it unifies a little bit top to bottom, that would be good. But I see what you're doing and I like what you're doing. So keep up.
My inspiration is like mangled roots meets coral meets mangrove tree.
Okay, that's good. I like it.
Cool.
I like it. I like the small negative spaces are one idea. The larger negative spaces are another idea.
Yeah.
Your larger planar masses are another idea. And then the linear forms are like a fourth idea. But they're all working together in a kind of a common vocabulary of form. So it's working for me now. Yeah.
Awesome.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. I got to go. I'm going to see you guys later. Thank you so much for coming today. Have a good weekend. I'll see you on Tuesday. Good luck with this.
See you later.
Bye.